So we're now ready to actually look at the user interface. So finally, we did a lot of work. We worked on our Room database, DAO, entities, and then we worked on the repository, and then we went to just finish our view model. So now it's time for us to see how we can use or invoke view model so we can get that data. Okay? This is the fun part per se. But you see that we went through this process, and I know it's cumbersome, and I know you may always think, okay, why do we go through all of this? But you see the benefits here is that once we have this infrastructure, we're free to scale up this application, to make this application as complex, as large as we possibly can, or as we want it to be, right? So it's really good because we have that set up, we have that infrastructure that is solid, and we know that we have all the moving parts set up correctly. Okay, so take the time to really go through this, to really understand, and always keep in mind the why we're doing this. Okay, so let's look at how we are going to use the view model in our user interface and start getting data. Okay, so let's open up our main activity first, and then we need note screen. Let's see, notes screen, note screen like this. Okay, so we have both of them because earlier we were using the view model this way. This no longer works. The way we instantiate it still works fine, right? You say note view model by models. Also, we could have done something like this, just different ways to instantiate our view model. We can say notes view model and say set it to view model like that, and then pass the type, which is our view model. Say note view model like this. Okay, so this also works. So that's just different options to do the same thing. All right, so we have this by, delegate, and view models like this. Again, passing our notes view model in our notes app, which is being called at the bottom here. Now, in this case here, we don't really need to actually instantiate it as such. We can just remove that. And for our notes here, what we're going to do is say note view model. We are going to do the following. Let's say dot note list, because remember in our view model we have this note list, which in this case is going to be our note list as flow, and this note list here is being fed through our note list private internal here. So that's what we're doing there. But this is not enough, because then we need to collect that information, because remember this is a flow, right? Which means just imagine that you have a pipe that has from one end the data is flowing in as a sequence, and at some point we need to collect it. I'm going to say dot collect as state like this, and then say value. And there we go. So we're collecting these values as flow as state, which is really important because we want that reactivity. They have to be stateful so that our composables can react to it and then change accordingly. Very good. And then, of course, we're passing this notes list here. And then on remove note, we say note view model. And then we want, I think I called delete. Let's see. What did we call it? Remove note, that it is. I'm going to just pass note or it like this. Same thing. Now we're having some issues here. If you have an oversize suspend function, remove note should be called only from a coroutine or another suspend function. All right, let's go back to our node view model. I think I made a mistake. Right. Well, these guys no longer have to be suspend because where are we getting them? You see, we are calling view model scope. So that is taking care of that already, right? So we don't need to do suspend anymore. That was my mistake. And now if we go to main, you see that this works just fine. Okay. And there we go. That's really all we need to do, because notice we say note list. We are passing, of course, starts from here. This is what we had before. We have node view, and I'm passing this way, view model, creating that view model, right? And then I'm passing through our notes app, that node view model, and then that's being fed through here. And then I'm creating a variable node list here and say view model, node list, and I say collect as state and get the value. So I want to make sure that this is containing that state as I'm collecting it. So we still have that sequence of data that's coming in and is stateful. Okay, it's very important. And of course we pass that node list into our note screen, because remember our note screen here requires list of notes so it can do its work. So on remove note, we pass the note view model that remove and pass the ID. In this case is the actual note. Hover over, it says note. The same thing to add, and voila. If you look at this, you can see how organized and compartmentalized all of this is now. The data layer is totally separate. All of this, it's all separate, and the UI only requires the view model and call the view model, which then call repository, which then has access to DAO. So if you look at the structures we have it now, you can see that it doesn't really matter where the data come from, right? Because if we have a repository, we could have the data coming from our database, but the data could also be coming from some other source. Notice that view model doesn't really care where the data comes from, because it gives this responsibility of worrying where the data is coming from. It gives it to our repository. And DAO is definitely who cares exactly where the data is coming from or how it's all being handled there, because this is what has the direct access to where the data is coming from in this case, right? And you can see you can scale this up to have data coming from an API outside our application. Like we have somewhere in remote server, we have data coming in, we can get that data and still access from here. We can get this data from a file somewhere in our phone, right? We can get this data from, doesn't matter, because the repository is the single source of truth for all the data, right? So that the user interface can communicate with. So that is the reason why to have a structure like this, to structure your apps, they have this clean architecture, they have this structure that is clean, that is concise and consistent. It's really helpful. It takes a little bit of work to put it all together, but it's worth it, especially once the applications get larger and more complex. Okay, I really want you to think about this and use this this structure as you put together your apps. It's very important. All right, so now let's see if this works, because we've done all this work and we don't really know if maybe we make mistakes somewhere and things are not working. But let's see. Let's go ahead and give it a run. I still have my emulator running, I believe. Let's see. I have my device, I should say. So I'm going to run and see if we can actually add and remove items and so forth. All right, so we're still getting this issue. Looks like cannot find implementation for NoteApp. NoteApp implementation does not exist. And looks like, again, if we're a module, so something is not right. Let's go back to, let's go to our NoteApp build and see. So for our room, we have, right. Because we're using Kotlin, there's another one we need to pass here, another dependency. So say capped, right? This is Kotlin annotation processing tool. So notice it has Android X, it's a room compiler, but this is for Kotlin annotation. So it's pretty much the same as this, passing the Kotlin annotation processing tool capped. And remember, we added that at the top here. We should have Kotlin capped as on our plugins. I think this should work. Let's go ahead and first of all sync. Okay, moment of truth. I think everything is synced up okay. Let's run once again and see. So it's time for debugging, because we can always miss something, but hopefully this time it all runs. Aha. Okay, so everything is great, because the reason why I know it's great, even though we're not going to see anything working here so far, is because this error is actually intentional, this new one. This is not what we were having before. So what is happening here is, let's see, it says here, cannot figure out how to save this field into the database. You can consider adding a type converter for it. So what's happening here is whenever we go, in fact, you can see it says note.java. So this is actually compiled note that we created in our class. Okay. So we're having an issue here with the UUID. Right? So if you go to our note, you'll see that our UID, it's a strange per se type. So what's happening is that room is very confused and doesn't know how to deal with this type. And the same will happen, and I know this because I've done this a few times, the same will happen with our data. So what it says here, we need to create a type converter. So what this is a way in which we can actually create a type that will convert this type that is not recognized in room into something that room will recognize. Because room is limited in the types that it can understand to add into the database, the engineers, the room engineers also gave us an option, the capability of creating these types so that these types can actually be saved onto the database, the room database. Okay, so this is good. By the way, again, I said this is a new error that I actually wanted for us to go through because it's important.